Thank you, Jessie. Before we go into the presentation, I'm going to hand over to Jessie, who will just tell you a few words about Community Energy South, in case there's anyone here who is not already deeply connected with us. Thank you, Jessie.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I will be brief because I wasn't actually aware I was going to do this, so I will make this as quick as possible. Welcome to Community Energy South webinar on governance. We are, I'm trying to move on from my slideshow. There it is. We are an umbrella organisation who have many member groups across the southeast and now up into Essex and even Norwich and spreading further and further. These are just a few of our community energy group memberships. Sustainable Overton, Energy Alton, they've all quite new groups. Then we have more established groups like Brighton Energy Co-op and Energise Sussex Coast, who've been active for many years now and very involved. Brighton Energy Co-op in solar on schools. Energise Sussex Coast are at the top of their game for fuel poverty outreach and help. We think that partnerships are the most important thing to building this sector, and we look to create strong partnerships with people like UK Power Networks, Scotia Gas Networks, County Council to build on community energy. We also working with the local energy hubs to embed community energy in their strategies for the future, and they have now done that as far as we are aware, and we're working with them as much as possible. Community Energy Pathways is one of our biggest focuses at the moment. We're working with the local councils. We've just started working with Surrey County Council as well. They're not on there, but they will be when I've updated this presentation. And I can see faces here that have come through the Pathways programme and helped to build their groups into bigger and better than ever before, and some from scratch that have come through the Pathways programme. So we're always looking to grow community energy in that way and strengthen the sector. I won't talk too much about the Eastern New Energy Project because we've stopped doing that now, but we are doing the South Eastern New Energy Project, which is very similar. And we're working to, again, along with our Pathways programme, to build community energy into everybody's lives. We want to be a catalyst across the southeast of England. Oh, and if you haven't already, then please sign up to our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter. Look at our website, become a member if you wish, if you're a community energy group, community organisation. And I will hand back to Liz now after that very speedy presentation, and we will carry on. Thanks, Liz.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm now going to hand over to Nicola, who is one of our mentors for Community Energy South. She's been mentoring lots of groups, including quite a few of you in Hampshire. So Nicola, can I hand over to you to introduce the session, please?
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Davidson, one of the mentors in the CES Pathways programme, supporting new groups to set up and develop projects. I'm going to introduce Penny Shepherd, Chair of Orchard Community Energy, to talk to us today about good governance. And I wanted to say a tiny bit first. I'm a professional fundraiser, and I must say that governance, while it can be a bit dry and seem like something which is a bit of a barrier, it truly is a gateway to stakeholder engagement, whether it's members, grant fund makers, or your local authority, etc. Essentially, good governance opens doors, it enables trust. And it's also about confidence, I think. Getting your governance right means you can proceed with confidence on that level. It's really important. So I'm really pleased that Penny's here today to talk to us about that. And I have plenty to learn. So thank you, Penny. I'm going to hand over to you and share your slides for you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Nicola. And thanks to everybody for coming to this session. This session is based on a presentation that I did last year to Bright Renewables, which is the trading name for community-owned asset management, which is Orchard, who manage Orchard's large-scale solar farm for us, or help or work with us to help us manage the solar array. But I've sort of adapted it for this particular audience. Nicola, do you want to share the slides? I can't see the, right. So I think the first thing to say is, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy for Community Energy South to share the presentation afterwards with anyone that wants it. As well as the presentation, there are a few more detailed slides on the end of it that I'm not planning to go through today. Also to say that although there's an Orchard Community Energy logo on these slides, that's because that was the format that I happened to have available. And this is very much my personal views rather than those of Orchard Community Energy or any other organisation that I deal with. But as I'll cover in a minute, I think my views are very much based on a background of working on boards and in the governance of community energy and other organisations for quite some time now. The thing I would challenge with what Liz said earlier is Liz described it as the paperwork. And I think if you take one thing away from it, this is that good governance is about implementing some simple principles in a way that works for you. And yes, it needs some paperwork as backup, but the secret is not to let the paperwork take over. And so this is so that it does become genuinely about doing good governance, not about compliance with a set of rules and regulations and expectations. I'm conscious that when you talk about governance, I'm still on the previous one, Nicola. Yeah, when you talk about governance, people rather divide into two groups. One are the people who go, oh yes, of course, it's obvious that we need good governance. And I will apologize to those people in advance, because quite a lot of this presentation is about why we need good governance. And why community energy boards should be concerned about good governance and implement good governance. So I move on a bit to the how towards the end, but I should warn you that quite a lot of it is about the why. And the second group is the people who go, how can you possibly try and constrain me in this way? I'm involved with community energy because I'm passionate about climate change. I really want to install new solar. I'm giving all this time, and you're trying to constrain my valuable time and my genuine good intentions into this sort of bureaucratic framework. And if that is your view, I hope I will have convinced you by the end of this presentation that first of all, that good governance is a necessary part of achieving what you want to achieve. And secondly, that it can be done in a way in which is appropriate for the scale of community energy and which doesn't degenerate into a load of bureaucracy and paperwork. We will see if I succeed. Right, so my agenda is, I'm going to talk to you a bit about my background, just where I come from, what I hope you'll get out of this, and then the stuff about what is governance, why bother about it, what's the legal framework. You know, after why bother, we get into the sort of details of what you need to do. What's the legal framework if you're a member of a community, you know, if you're a director of a community energy organization, what sort of good practice codes are there out there, and what other supporting resources are there? And then finally, what are the key things that I hope you'll take away from this? The next one, Nicola. So basically, as Liz and Nicola said, I'm chair of Orchard Community Energy. I'm actually also a member of the steering group for Kent Community Energy, which is a Kent County Council-wide community energy society. But in the past, I've been a board member of organisations that have managed quite significant amounts of public money. So Smart Energy GB are the people who do the advertising for the smart meter rollout and spend really quite a lot of energy bill payers' money on doing that publicity. And I was a director there looking out for the interests of consumers. And stopping the process getting hijacked by the energy companies for about 3 years up until last year. And I've also been a trustee I was a trustee for 6 years of Local Trust, which ran a £200 million lottery funded programme of long-term community development in underserved, disadvantaged communities. I've also been involved with professional regulation. I was a lay member of the regulation board of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries for about 7 years, I think that was. And then going back to when I had a full-time job, I ran, among other things, the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, which looks, among other issues, at the importance of governance in making decisions about which companies to invest in, and trying to ensure that you invest in companies that don't blow up. Next one. So what I hope you will come out from this is understanding governance, i.e. what boards do, why it matters, legal framework, etc. Be aware of some useful resources and have sufficient knowledge to consider how your community energy board should take this forward. There will be time for questions afterwards, and I think the usual model is if you pop your questions on the chat, Liz or one of the others will pick them up and feed them back to me. And Liz and co, if there's any question that comes up on the chat that you think I should pick up during the presentation, do interrupt me and ask me of it. Otherwise, I'll assume we're picking up the questions at the end. And this is all the sort of high level stuff, but in the questions, by all means pick up some of the points of detail. What about bribery? What about forced labor and anti-slavery and that sort of question, by all means. So next slide. So what is governance? I mean, I picked this definition somewhere off the internet, but in essence, governance is what boards do, and management is what management do, which isn't a very helpful definition. And there is continuing debate about the boundaries between the two. But in essence, governance is about the high level stuff, the vision, the values, the strategy, the policies, and the strategic oversight. And then the management is the day-to-day planning and organizing and doing the things that management have been given delegated responsibility by the board to do. So basically, governance is what boards do, and it's the high-level stuff. Next slide. So if you're on a community energy board, you will almost certainly do a mixture of governance and management, particularly if you've got no staff. And indeed, also as an individual, you may also do what I would call operational volunteering. And so the secret is to sort of the secret is to try to sort of segment in your mind those three roles. When are you doing governance? When are you doing management? And when are you doing sort of operational volunteering? Yeah, Alex, I hope what governance is will become clearer as I talk further. We go on to the next slide. This is a very simple example. This is Mike. Mike is definitely a volunteer on a community energy stall that we ran last month, because Mike is not on our board, but everybody else that was personing the board, personing the stall, happened to be a member of the Orchard Community Energy Board. But in personing the stall, they weren't acting as board members, they were acting as volunteers. So volunteering was turning up, talking to people on the stall, collecting their details for the newsletter and so on. Managing was organizing with the market we have the stall in, arranging to get the banner there, arranging the rota of volunteers, making sure the leaflets were available, that sort of thing. Whereas governing was about making the decision that that actually we wanted to raise our profile, and that we wanted to raise our profile without spending too much money on it. And therefore, in a way, we then handed over to our management role to say, right, the way we want to raise our profile is by doing this store. But the actual strategic decision of why are we doing this was, and how much money are we putting into doing it, and what sort of outcomes do we want to get out of it is the governing bit. And as you see, it's a relatively subtle distinction, and the details of the boundaries don't really matter that much. What actually matters is that the governing is part of the picture. Not just piling into doing something. Next one. So why do governance? And a lot of the why governance is around corporate governance, but it also strikes me that at the moment, we're also heavily into issues seeing the effects of governance failures in the public sector as well, indeed in government. So basically, governance provides the framework for operational activity. It provides a mechanism to be accountable to the outside world, and it reduces what's called, again, within the context of normal type organizations, it reduces what is known as the principal agent problem. So basically, a community energy society is owned by its members. But there's a danger that it starts getting run in the interests of the people who are directly involved with it, rather than in the interests of its community, or where appropriate, its members. And governance sort of sits in between those external stakeholders and plays the role as, if you like, the guardian of the conscience of the organization, of ensuring that it does continue to act in the way that its objects say that it should. Governance also ensures transparency, and ensures that decisions are challenged, and therefore better decisions are made. And there is plenty of academic evidence, particularly from looking at large companies, that in the long term good governance pays. The normal summary description is it's only when the tide goes out that you see who isn't wearing a swimming costume. That quite often governance comes to its own when things start to go wrong, or potentially might go wrong, and governance aims to stop nasty surprises, stop things blowing up, and being able to deal with the fallout if or when they do. So it ensures that organizations aren't directionless, aren't ineffective, don't focus on the wrong things, don't breach their values, aren't run in the interests of the wrong stakeholders, and ultimately aren't corrupt. And a lot of concern about good governance came originally from things like the Maxwell scandal, the Mirror Pension Fund scandal, from the scandals around Enron in the States, and so on. But most recently, it's been interesting to see just this week about the court case around the appointment of Dido Harding as head of Test and Trace, where basically what the courts found was that there had been a governance failure, i.e. the Secretary of State hadn't taken into account or wasn't able to demonstrate that they had adequately taken into account the public sector equality duty in making that appointment. Not necessarily a bad appointment, but not done following due process to ensure that the best possible outcomes were achieved. And indeed, if you going back to things like the expenses scandal in Parliament 10 years ago, again, that was in many ways a governance failure, that the way people started to do things around here got out of step with what stakeholders expected. And then when when sunlight started to be shone on what was happening, that became clear. You could say Partygate comes in the same sort of category, that there should have been sufficient oversight to say, wait a minute, if this gets out, it is going to look really bad. So why bother about governance? Next slide. So yes, first of all, avoid nasty surprises. Secondly, to protect your reputation, and also to protect the reputation of your board members. And by and large, good board members should want good governance, because good board members should not want to be associated with an organization that may damage their reputation. As Nicola said earlier, meet expectations and requirements. And quite often those expectations and requirements for community energy can come from funders. It can also come from members. It can come from rooftop owners and the like. At Orchard, one of the things we're doing a lot of work on is we've had to develop, we've developed a bribery policy. We've looked at procurement issues in the supply chain, particularly because we have a solar array on the roof of a company that's a B Corp, and they demand that from their supply chain, and we're part of their supply chain. Yeah, I mean, so meeting stakeholder expectations leads, as Nicola said, to being able to attract support. And also good governance ensures that when you do attract support, you find ways to use that support well, whether that supports people, time, or money, or whatever. And also more generally, I think there's, by individual community energy societies avoiding scandals and being well run, you protect the community energy movement as a whole. Because we are dependent as a movement on being seen as a good thing that genuinely acts in the interests of the community. And also, particularly around things like community share offers, we benefit from really very light touch regulation. And if there are scandals, then one effect of scandals will be to see a pressure on the regulators to tighten up on that regulation, which may then make it much harder for us to operate as small voluntary organizations. Ultimately, it's about not getting prosecuted, not getting sued, and not getting deregistered by the FCA. And if anyone tries, going back to the paperwork, being able to have the evidence to defend yourself and your organization if anyone does try to do that. So next slide. So this is just my kind of key messages for the first time, which is this is organized common sense. This is not rocket science. This is about culture. It is not about compliance. You need to come up with stuff that's appropriate for the scale and purpose of the organization. You need to, what's most important is to consider the issues, and then yes, document what you do as policies and processes. But what that means is you've then got a framework for rapidly saying, well, what have we decided already? And then a framework for rapidly reviewing things and saying, is that still appropriate for us? Rather than reinventing wheels every time an issue comes up. Do crib documents from others, do tweak them, do find suitable templates online. And we were talking earlier, before the start of the webinar, about the potential for Community Energy South. to provide a sort of library of templates to make it easier for community energy societies to implement what they need. And you know, I think Community Energy South are very interested in doing that. It's fair to say that pretty well everything you need is online, but there's a lot to be said about not having to go and look for it. And finally, you know, underpinning all of this is really, you know, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Sort of, if what you're doing and why you're doing it is transparent, and your policies are clear and available to other people so that they can see what you're doing, is things are less likely to go wrong. But also, not just things are less likely to go wrong, there is less likely to be suspicion that things are done for the wrong reasons. And I'll come to that in a minute. Yeah, so doing this, spending an appropriate amount of time on it makes sense. Getting bogged down in too much bureaucracy doesn't. And there is a sensible route through this stuff. Next slide. So what are you legally required to do if you are a constituted organization, and if you're an unincorporated association, then there is no legal framework, and each member of the unincorporated association is jointly and severally liable as a private individual for what it does. But once you start doing projects and attracting investment and so on, you are likely to need to be constituted, probably either as a KIC or as a community benefit society. The Companies Act applies to KICs because KICs are companies, and the general view is that the Companies Act, or the director's duties and other requirements listed in the Companies Act, there is an expectation that they also apply to community benefit societies, although I'm not sure that that's said explicitly in the Cooperatives and Community Benefit Societies legislation. The Companies Act is online. You can find, KIC is community interest company. So a community interest company is a type of limited company that operates in the interests of the community rather than the interest of its shareholders. So the Companies Act says that the duties lays out the duties of directors, which is to, and if you fail to go along with these, in principle, you can get fined or struck off and so on. I totally accept it is pretty unlikely that as a director of a community energy society that would happen, but nevertheless, these are legal responsibilities rather than nice to have. So you are required to act within your powers. You're required to promote the success of the company, and within the Companies Act, that's for the benefit of its members as a whole. Within the context of community benefit societies, it's for the benefit of your community as a whole. So that's about not putting the interests of some stakeholders above the interests of others. You're required to exercise independent judgment, not just do as you're told, and exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence. You're required to avoid conflicts of interest between your role as a director and the other interests that you or people close to you may have. You're not allowed in your capacity as a director to accept benefits from third parties. And you have to declare your interests in any transactions or arrangements with the company. So if the company has, if the company buys something from another company that you're a shareholder of, you have to declare that sort of thing. And also within the Companies Act, there are mandatory record keeping requirements. And those records have to be retained for 10 years. And that's both to be able to provide evidence and also to ensure that, you know, if there is anything dodgy going on, you can't cover it up by getting rid of the evidence, because then you can just get done for not having the records of the decisions. So you are required as a board to keep minutes of board meetings, to keep minutes of general meetings, to keep records for 10 years of resolutions passed outside general meetings. And if you are a wholly owned subsidiary, you are required to keep a record of decisions made by your parent company in their capacity as your sole owner. So that's what the Companies Act says. Next one. There are other directors' duties scattered across other bits of legislation, of which the most, the key ones are, first of all, you have a duty of confidentiality to the company, i.e., to keep secret its secrets, and that feeds through to, for example, the company has a confidentiality agreement with another organization, then as a director, you are bound to implement that confidentiality agreement. You have a duty to ensure health and safety compliance, and basically, you know, you are unlikely to be sent to prison if someone dies as a result of getting an electric shock from your solar array. But nevertheless, ultimately, you are where the buck stops for making sure that doesn't happen, and ensuring that the oversight is in place and the systems are in place to ensure that it doesn't happen. And some of you will remember that some of the reason that those directors' responsibilities were introduced was around the perceived behaviour of railway company boards back in the days when there were a lot of fatalities, you know, and train crashes taking place. And finally, it's your responsibility of ensuring that the company complies with various environmental and anti-corruption legislation, and for large companies, also legislation around things like anti-slavery under the Modern Slavery Act, or at least around declaring what you do in that instance. So there's a sort of set of legal requirements underpinning good governance. Next slide. So, you know, it's good governance could seem a bit nebulous, but what does bad governance look like? And I think all of these sort of relate to things that we might do. So acting outside your powers, going, oh yeah, I'm sure this will be okay by the board, I'll just sign this contract. If you sign the contract without a board decision or without you having agreed delegated authority to the board, you are personally liable for that contract, unless the board subsequently ratifies your decision. Putting the interests of particular stakeholders before those of the company and community, you know, sort of my mate Fred desperately needs to get his money out, therefore we should let him withdraw his share capital. Even though that's, you know, not in line with the with our share withdrawal policy or with the best interests of our community. Not managing conflicts of interest, and it's about managing conflicts of interest, not about not having conflicts of interest. So this is the first one is a real example. So, you know, my son runs a website development company. My Community Energy Society needs a website. We should pay my son to develop the website because we'll get the best possible, you know, we'll get a good deal from him because he's my son. From the outside, that doesn't look good. And also it is against, you know, managing conflicts of interest, the requirement to manage conflicts of interest. In fact, what happened for that particular Community Energy Society was, in fact, the chair's son was a website developer. But what the Community Energy Society did was they set up a process for deciding who they were going to commission to design their website. The chair excused himself from the process. So the decision was made by directors that were not associated with any of the website developers. Various people, they found a number of people to apply for the work. They assessed who, would give them the best deal, and they appointed the chair's son. And that was absolutely fine, because they had a transparent process that they could talk about publicly. And first of all, they were able to demonstrate that it wasn't corrupt. They were able to demonstrate that they got the best deal. And also, by being transparent about it, they were able to reassure any concerns that maybe there was something a bit whiffy about this, even if there wasn't. Not exercising reasonable care. I mean, I'm happy to be on the board, but I don't have time to read papers or regularly attend meetings is the classic one. Sort of, I will be on the board as a figurehead type. It will be useful for you to have me on the letterhead. An individual saying that is in breach of directors' duties, because they're not in a position to, and not intending to, exercise reasonable care, skill and diligence. Similarly, taking a recommendation and just accepting it without kind of looking at it, reading it, deciding if it seems acceptable. Clearly, exercising reasonable skill, care and diligence is about, again, operating at the appropriate level, not assuming, not needing to have the skills of any specialist making a recommendation, but nevertheless using your common sense, looking at it, seeing if it makes sense, and if you do have particular skills yourself, bringing those skills to bear in that decision-making process, rather than leaving them outside the door. And I think the key point with all of these, it's not just what the outcome is, but how you got to that decision, and being able to demonstrate that by having policies in place and by recording decisions in minutes. Next one. There are various good practice codes out there for different sizes of organization. The sort of granddaddy of them is the UK Corporate Governance Code, which is developed over the last 30 years and is basically for listed companies. There is a cooperative corporate governance code, and there's also a charity governance code. And the next slide, I've picked up stuff from the charity governance code. And I have no particular views on the merits of the cooperative corporate governance code versus the charity corporate governance code. One nice thing about the charity governance code is that it has recommendations for smaller charities as well as large ones. And so it is taking account of what's appropriate at a particular scale. But all of them, frankly, again, boil down to organized common sense. So if we look at, next slide. So this is the framework that's used in the charity corporate governance code. So the foundations, it's built on a foundation of the role of a director and the context that they operate within. And then it divides recommendations and good practice examples into these categories. And quite why they've all got one in front of them, I'm not sure. When I did the original slide, they were numbered in line with the picture. But those areas are generally recognized as the sort of headings for looking at good governance within. And on the extra slides in the appendix, I've got, there's some further details of what's covered by each of those. Or equally well, if you Google the charity or cooperative good governance guide, you'll get much more details on that. So, next slide. What is available to support you? 3 slides on this. first of all, the sort of policies that you're likely to need, and for which there are good templates and examples out on the web. Conflicts of interest policy, which tend to be quite simple, but where your key decisions tend to be around if there is a decision and there are people who have conflicts, do they declare them and participate in the decision, or do they leave the room? Or when do they declare them and participate in the decision, and when do they leave the room? A policy about risk management, your health and safety policy, various policies about increasingly cybersecurity and data protection, which actually can be quite thorny for a community energy society. Questions like, where do you store personal data? How do you, do people use their private email addresses, or do you require them to use an organizational email address? Bearing in mind that they're much more likely to pick up an email and respond quickly if they use their personal email address. How do you avoid people's personal data getting splattered across the hard drives of a load of people who may then leave the board? That sort of question. Potentially, you may need a bribery policy. Orchard's had to put a bribery policy in place recently because the owner of the purchaser of the energy from our rooftop requires their supply chain to have bribery policies. We nicked one from the cooperative assistance network and simplified it. We think, it's what we would have done anyway, i.e. we don't take bribes, but now we've got it written down. Particularly topical at the moment, having an anti-slavery stroke, a policy on anti-slavery stroke forced labour, where again, there's potentially some difficult decisions to be made, because at the moment, probably the only way that you can totally avoid forced labour in the solar supply chain is by stopping installing and letting climate change rip. And is that really what you want to do? So there's some, genuine debates about deciding what you are willing to do, having the discussion about it, documenting it, and then, in our view, being transparent about what decisions you've made. You probably need a share interest policy. If you've got shares, you probably need a share withdrawal policy, building on your rules as a community benefit society. And you may need policies about how you make grants and deliver community benefit, that sort of thing. Next one. The sort of documents that you need to look at or create, I would suggest that first of all, you do need to be aware of your rules as a community benefit society, because ultimately you need to follow your rules. You need to be aware of company law and community benefit society law, and you need to be aware of the FCA's requirements. For example, in particular, their guidance. If you're doing a community share offer, do read the FCA guidance on community share offers, as well as the Community Shares Handbook, and take appropriate advice. As I've said, you do need your written board minutes. There's a lot to be said for having a board appointment letter and board job descriptions, because if board members have signed a board appointment letter, then if they do something which is sort of against your common expectations of board members, then you have a mechanism for holding them to account and if necessary, inviting them to resign. Declarations of interest, where normal practice is to require an annual update of people's declarations of interest, and also to record in the minutes of any board meeting what relevant interests any directors have. At Orchard, we have a schedule of delegated powers, which is a grand description for one side of A4, which says what decisions we have delegated to particular individuals or other organizations, and when we delegated it, and when we last updated the delegation, and who we delegated it to, which says things like, basically, you know, I am responsible for writing the newsletter, but the board then reviews the newsletter at its next meeting to check that it broadly said what they had in mind. But I don't have to send it round and get everybody to rubber stamp it. A risk register. A risk register is both important and useful because it's a mechanism for managing risks. So a risk register lists out your big risks and then what you do to, what steps you're taking to manage and mitigate them. And then we do a rolling review of our risk register, looking at each type of risk. We have our risks grouped by category, you know, strategic risks, operational risks, public policy risks, and so on. We review each category, one category at each board meeting. So we get round them in just over a year. And then if something nasty happens, like the forced labour issue, we suddenly realize, oopsie, we didn't spot that in our risk register and add it to it. And then we also have a board forward plan, which can be really useful to manage your board agenda and ensure that you spread consideration of topics and that you have a schedule for reviewing things which runs across a period of time. And so you're not reinventing the wheel at each board meeting. Next one. We're getting to the end now. Yes, so a set of sort of useful websites with information about governance on them. Unfortunately, the Small Charities Coalition used to be very useful, but they're closing this year. But there's still an organisation called Small Charity Support. Next one. Next and last one, I think. Yes, so sort of summarising the messages. This is really about organized common sense. And yes, you can have the slides electronically if you want them. I'll leave it to community. Yeah, this says yes. It's about, it's about your mindset and the documentation to back it up. It's not about, oh my God, we've got to do this. And then it's about thinking it through. It's ultimately about making sure that your show stays on the road. A lot of it's about managing risks. Some of it is about managing opportunities. Ensure that you stay on the road, that you're highly regarded by your stakeholders, that everybody loves you, and pours lots of energy into helping you achieve your aims. Last slide. Just to say thank you for listening. I always seem to land up talking longer than I think I'm going to, but we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards. And so, Liz or whoever, what do you want to do about questions?
Thank you. Oh, hang on a minute.
You are booming.
There we are. No, that's not working. Right, how's that? No. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you fixed it.
Jessie and I are sitting next to each other, so we have to mute ourselves and unmute ourselves. So I hope you can hear me all right, because I'm now...
We can hear you through Jessie by the sound of it.
Exactly.
That's right, yeah.
So first of all, I want to say thank you, Penny. I thought that was comprehensive and illuminating, and it's given rise to lots of questions and discussion points. We've got some really good questions in the chat box. And I also have some questions because I also work for a community energy group. But let me pass, we've written a list of the questions. I think Alex from Chelsea had the first question. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Alex, and then I'm handing over to Chris from Avesco. Alex, are you there?
Alex.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to unmute and it wasn't working. Thank you. Well, I've sort of asked two questions, so I don't know which one you deemed slightly more pertinent, but I will have a guess. maybe it was around the first one, and I like this snappy summing up of what good governance is, because if you've got to try and raise the issue internally with the board, that for other people that are focusing on, you know, more on the management or the operations side of things, and think governance is just, you know, a pain in the neck, a waste of time, there's resistance to, you know, accepting that that's part of your role as a director. So to raise the conversation, I liked your neat summing up of, it was about the implementation of, was it principles or values? There was a really succinct way that you described it. And also my other question was, could a register of seasoned directors who might be interested in taking on other community energy directorships for those in the sort of post-startup stage of a community energy group, for want of a better phrase. And that could be in this more virtual Zoom focused world we are now much more living in. That could be an option if you wanted to utilize something like co-option. If you wanted to get people in with particular skill sets or relevant experience for particular aspects that the board might feel light on, for want of a better phrase, and then it would get around the issue of them not being a member previously. So 2 slightly vague questions.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of recruiting the right mix of directors, then yes, I mean, you know, sort of skill, you know, in a way, the board skill. Oh, something is, Jessie, I think I'm booming now, aren't I? Oh no, I'm not. I'm okay. Yeah, ensuring, you know, board succession planning and getting the right mixture of skills on the board is part of good governance. I think, you know, sort of, it's like not every board member needs to be a community energy expert, and also you may well find that there are people in your local community who can bring the expertise in governance, for example, from being directors of other organizations, and that are interested in community energy but haven't got the background or experience of it. So it's also about going outside the movement, I think, to find people. We've just recruited a couple of people to the Orchard board, very much, I'm afraid, on a sort of tap on the shoulder basis. One of whom is the former director of finance of our local authority, and another one of whom is a local businessman who's just in the process of retiring from his company. And in both cases, I think, you know, they bring that sort of skill. The danger is that they're too, you know, having too much large company skills can be a problem, because some people kind of don't appreciate that actually, you know, there isn't a team sitting there to implement their decisions and that sort of thing. So it is about finding the right people. But certainly the ex-director of finance was very useful when we came to doing our board appointment letter, in terms of saying, yes, I know this sounds intimidating, but actually it really is necessary. Does that answer it, Alex? But yeah, the question of whether there should be a register is one I will leave to see it for Community Energy South.
Which is also, yeah, an interesting idea. And we will discuss that internally. If anyone has any comments they'd like to make about that, do please put them in the chat box. It's certainly an interesting idea. I don't know if Nicola has views on that as a CES mentor. Again, I think it might be about bandwidth and capacity.
Sorry, I came out for a moment. Can you repeat the question?
It was about the possibility of setting up a kind of a directory of potential directors.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I also think that a repository of template policies would be useful. Although from a legal perspective, Community Energy England did advise me a while ago that it's a little bit dodgy sharing a legal template in case it doesn't completely fit the other organisation. So caveats.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think the answer to that is, is this sort of be practical? Whopping great caveats. When we did our risk register, when Orchard did its risk register, we borrowed the risk registers to start with from Bath and West, and they were very twitchy about handing it over because they sort of said, look, we won't be liable if you just rubber stamp our risk register and it's not appropriate for you. And eventually we persuaded them, no, we wouldn't do that. But actually the reality is that most risks are common among community energy societies, and therefore having a template is useful. And it surely isn't beyond the wit of people to come up with an appropriate disclaimer, which says basically, here's an example, but don't believe a word of it. We take no liability for it whatsoever. It's meant to help you.
We are definitely going to do that. I think that would be a really good resource, and we have just the person that will do it for us. So
yes.
Right.
We've been writing notes as you've been talking, Penny.
But these, I mean, you can find these things elsewhere on the internet. So other people have been able to make them available without, without going overboard of paying lawyers a fortune to check that the disclaimer is appropriate or whatever.
I would also suggest that as a cooperative movement, so to speak, we need to collaborate and support each other. So sharing is good, and I'm all for sharing and helping others to save time, because we haven't got a lot of time with this climate emergency and our agendas that we're trying to push forward.
On which note, I see there were quite a lot of questions about forced labour. And just to say that, apologies if this duplicates what's already been said on the chat, Community Energy England have recently agreed to coordinate some work on developing common policies or sample policies on the forced labour issue. Orchard has developed a public statement about what we, about our current arrays and what we are going to do in the short term, but it's a tricky one, quite genuinely, because I think over time more non-Chinese capacity will develop. The Solar Trade Association, or whatever it's called now, Solar Energy UK, is doing work on improving transparency in solar supply chains. But at the moment, even if you manage to get transparency for the panels, you're unlikely to get which you won't, you're unlikely to get transparency for the materials in the panels or for the inverters or whatever. So it's a really difficult one. I mean, we've been fortunate on the Orchard board in that one of our board members is a human rights specialist in her past life, and has, and we've worked with her to kind of come up with what's the right balancing act. But ultimately, it is a balancing act, because I think the only way to be sure that you've avoided forced labour in new installations is not to do any new installations. And many people would say that the climate emergency feeling, means that isn't an option. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. But I mean, the Orchard stuff, happy to make available, because we want to be transparent about what they're doing. In terms of the of stuff we've got installed already, Bright did a piece of work for us looking at the companies that were implicated in the Sheffield Hallam University report on forced labour in China. And and identifying whether our panels were manufactured by any of the companies listed there. We were fortunate, and in that our ground-mounted solar array was installed in early 2016, and generally speaking, panels from before that was before the most egregious problems started to arise. But our most recent rooftop array comes from I can't remember the details. It's a company that's got a policy against forced labour, but there's no particular evidence that they audit against the policy or anything. And certainly the host of our rooftop is raising questions about whether we should use the same installer in the UK as we used for that panel in the future, because there is a UK industry supply chain statement that we've signed up to, and that most of the major installers have signed up to, but our particular installer, which is a small sort of a small business, isn't for some reason isn't keen to sign up. Chris says, isn't it about manufacturing here in the UK? Well, that would be nice, but not at the moment. I mean, frankly, the Americans are ramping up their manufacturing. I think the Germans are as well. So one will be in a position to be able to purchase from elsewhere. But at the moment, there is, a large proportion of the supply comes from China.
I think actually the issue, there's sort of different levels of issues around the manufacturing, because there's the assembly of the modules, which can happen anywhere because it's just sticking it all together. But I've got a feeling, because I used to work for a solar manufacturer, that the actual polycrystalline silicon thing that gets sliced up, I can't remember what you call it, but the bit that gets sliced up and put into the cells, I think I've got a feeling that is only made in China. I think there might be one where they make it in Canada, but yeah.
I mean, the USA has introduced some import controls, import bans, and so we might see more manufacturing in the States. Chris is saying there's a German manufacturer that's very expensive. The challenge there is twofold. One is that if we purchase from there, then somebody else is buying Chinese because they can't buy the German, and also it may make the profit margins are not brilliant at the moment. Actually, making our installations stack up financially can be difficult, and it's not clear that the question is, how much more can we afford to spend on the panels before the installation becomes unviable? But anyway, this sounds dreadfully negative on my part, and I'm not negative. I think we should do the maximum that we can, clearly. And yes, we should work together to influence the market, but we should also recognize that community energy is a small part of the market. And actually, the commercial suppliers, I mean, sort of basically, if you're Tesco's or someone like that, you don't want 30 solar panels on your roof because it's very reputationally damaging. So the big players in this market are concerned as well.
Thank you. We could carry on talking about solar modules, but there are other elements of governance too. So I'd like to invite Stuart Bird, who had a question. A more general question about governance, I think. Stuart, could you unmute yourself? I know you're still here, I just can't see you. Well, okay, who's after Stuart? Maybe he's disappeared. He had a question about risk assessment, but let's wait for him to reappear. Then we had Brian.
Sorry, I'm back, sorry.
Great.
It was really just a very quick observation that at that point in the presentation that doing the risk assessments. I think you covered it very well later on, Penny, when you started talking about risk registers and everything. So
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks, Stuart.
Right, and then Brian, is that Colin Olivers? Brian Colin Olivers.
Hello. Thank you. One of the things I'm a little bit confused about is the process of actually getting people interested in an idea, and the sort of conception then and inception and then rolling forward into all the considerations that Penny's very ably put together, and whether there are any heffalump traps at the very start. There's only me in my office. There's at the very start of I'll tell you the little story behind this. Is I got on Winch City Council in 1986, which was an awful long time ago. But I was still quite an old man then. So you could tell the council houses in Winchester from the private sector houses, because all the council houses had double glazing, because Winchester City Council had set up their own company to make double glazing, was installing them on council houses and some others, I don't know which others. So the problem I'm facing in Oliver's Battery is that the getting rid of boilers and things like that will mean that a lot of people in Oliver's Battery will want to sink boreholes for ground source heat pumps. And I just have a vague ambition that it would be nice to set up something that actually did it not particularly for profit, and did it in Oliver's Battery, especially where people want to club together and share boreholes and things, or share sites for boreholes on the edges of properties. And whether that's a good thing or bad thing. So what I was looking for today was, are there any heffalump traps that are one or to plan away at the inception of a project, or call to action side of it? And what are they? I was looking in Penny's talk, but I couldn't discern any that would really give me a problem in 2 years' time if I haven't done them now before I've even started floating the ideas amongst friends, neighbors, colleagues, and other things. And I actually don't know how to set up a company. Even the advert saying anybody fancy this as an idea might be problematical.
So, I mean, in terms of setting up, a new not-for-profit business, I suppose I don't know to what degree the Community Energy South mentoring system can help, but also there's various help around, developing business plans and that sort of thing. I mean, in terms of the governance, I think some of it is about setting as you develop the organization, setting the vision and values, but and also kind of not over promising and not not making what sounds like commitments but aren't. But I think, setting up, developing a new organization is a specialist area in its own right. That I think that the mentoring program is designed to provide support on.
Thank you.
And I've no idea what's appropriate scale for borehole, for heat pump installation businesses and that sort of thing. I know there's certainly some expertise out there in managing the implementation of heat pumps within the community energy world. Although I think they normally get in a specialist constructor to actually do the physical installation.
Actually, Brian, you may want to speak to a colleague of mine from Avesco called Nikki Myers. So message me afterwards, because her background was boreholes for a few years for heat pumps. So yeah, get in touch and I'll give you her contact details. I want to hand back to Chris Rowland, who had loads of questions, and one in particular about getting new board members and how you rotate them. And what's that say?
It was covered a bit when we talked about a directory of, you know, potential board members, but that may want to elaborate on that.
Yes, and for me as well, there's a question, or you know, there's a discussion to be had, I think, about in community energy groups how we manage the issues of time, governance, and project delivery. You know, I know that's an issue as an executive member at Avesco. I know that's an issue, and I would personally be interested in people's comments or experiences on how to manage those what sometimes feel, you know, just feels like there's not enough time to do all these things.
Yes, it's not a problem specific to community energy. And yes, one thing I didn't major on that that is regarded within the governance world as important is succession planning for the board, and actually board rotation as well. I can remember going along to a cooperative group meeting, you know, the Cooperative Wholesale Society and things, back in the days before they blew up, you know, started to have problems. And people were being praised because they'd been on various committees, for various cooperative movement committees for 30 years. And I went, wait a moment, that is really bad governance. That actually, you know, most, and in fact, you may well find this is written in your rules already. Most boards regard it as good practice that there is a maximum term and that people have to spend time away from the board, even if they then come back to it after that term. But that generally speaking, there should be a planned rotation of board members over time. And generally speaking, you know, about 9 years is seen as the maximum length of time in which certainly what you might call non-executive board members, I mean, non-employees should be on a board. And also, while recognizing that people who are employed may be on a board for longer, that those need quite often nowadays that those should be in a minority. But yes, board succession planning is important in lots of ways, and it's not good for people, I don't think, to stay on a particular board for too long. One of the challenges we've got as Orchard is that we were formed in 2015, and so we've got quite a lot of directors coming to the end of their term over the next few years, which is, and we are trying to refresh the board. And as part of the process, we're trying to localize the board as well. We're trying to get more board members who are local rather than ones who are interested in community energy but live some distance away, like me.
And how are you going about that, Penny?
Rather unscientifically. I mean, we put stuff in our newsletter. Classically, we put stuff in our newsletter saying any members, particularly local members, interested in getting more involved, either as a board member or a volunteer, please let us know. But I think there's a lot of experience from voluntary organizations generally that quite often people get involved when they're tapped on the shoulder. So it's also about having the network and you know, following, getting the right balance between being open and inclusive and enabling people to put themselves forward, and actually tapping people on the shoulder and encouraging people with the skills that you think will be useful to do that. Yeah, I mean, someone's making the point that it will be useful to trying to improve the age mix. And it's difficult because a lot of the, at the same time, one should recognize that by and large, it's people who are not working full time or no longer working full time who have the time to do this sort of stuff.
Thank you. We're getting lots of interesting things popping up in the chat box now. Tanya, do you want to say anything more about the skills matrix? Like, do you have a template?
I have a mental template. But I haven't actually got something written down, but it is a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think the skills that you need are what, we're conscious on the Orchard board that basically we're 7 and about to become 8 at the moment, and we've got 2 people who are technical, we've got 2 people who are finance, or particularly sort of financial model type finance. We've got me, who's got a bit of legal and governance and a bit of convening, and we've got a couple of people who have detailed local knowledge. And actually, the local knowledge is unfortunately the easiest thing to find. Finding the legal, all voluntary organisations struggle with finding the finance people.
I think some of that was actually covered in our last webinar, business planning, which is available on the newsletter. I'll send a link out to that, but I can send that presentation out as well. That covers what you should have as a sort of core group, your core group and your wider group, and what you should look for.
Nicola? Oh, we can't hear you.
Don't look like you're muted.
Even though you're not muted, we can't hear you. No, we still can't hear you. Maybe put it in the chat box. We'd like. While we wait for Nicola to put her comments in the chat. Oh, someone's got their hand raised. Who's this? Oh no, it's still Nicola.
Just go ahead. Her question is long.
Oh yes. Well, we're looking. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. Anybody? Right. Well, I think we'll just have to wait while Nicola starts to write her question. What's a pity we couldn't hear her. No, we still can't hear you. You could ring me and I could put you on speaker.
High tech solutions going on here. Is Penny
can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes. Why don't you?
It was me who asked about the skills matrix, partly from my role as a governor. But also yesterday, someone was saying that our test source community energy has a really good mix of people. We should be promoting that more. And so from listening to you today, and I'm sorry I missed the first hours of another call, but I wrote that down as a way for us to promote ourselves as well. But I thought I heard one of the earlier guys, Brian, I think it was, if you want to try and set something out, work out what you need to do and work out then what skills you need as well to then fulfill those skills. So as maybe something to think about in the bath or whatever. But yeah, that's where the skills matrix is a useful tool to use. But thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to put my speaker on my phone on loudspeaker now, so we can hear Nicola.
Great, can you hear me? Oh, it's a bit boomy. Okay, my question. It's not good. It's not good.
Just turn your sound off on your computer.
Is that better?
Yep. There you go.
Great. My point was that the discussion about board membership and getting enough people is in my view really valued, and it's something that many groups struggle with. Rotation, absolutely, I think that's really important, and I hadn't considered that before. Getting sufficient numbers, it's useful, I think, to bring in more senior volunteers who aren't board members. And then they grow in confidence and familiarity, and then they will often step up as board members. But in terms of the skill base, we all want someone with legal capacity, financial capacity, marketing, and so on. It can be valuable to try and get local companies to donate some time as an ordinary member to lend their capacity, just as a temporary skill donation. And it can respond well to their corporate social responsibility aspirations, meeting that in terms of their green commitment. Also, I think it could be a useful process for board members to also volunteer on another board just as a member temporarily, so that they can share that knowledge and perhaps pick up best practice from another board that they can bring back to their group. So really operating in a sort of cooperative way by spreading the resource and reaching out. It helps to improve the network. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yes, thank you. Those were I really like those ideas. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask or contribute? Okay, well, in that case, it looks like, unless I've missed anyone, it looks like time to end the session. Thank you so much, Penny. I was very impressed with your ability to give a presentation and keep your eye on the chat box and answer questions as they were coming up. I thought that was quite a skill, as well as your very illuminating and thought-provoking presentations about governance. So thank you so much for your time and what you've contributed, and thank you everybody for participating. I hope it's going to give you lots of useful food for thought, and we'll start working on our locating templates to share. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.